It is time to begin our class. We're going to be looking at lesson 11 today, and this is where David learns about Mephibosheth, who is a son of Jonathan. And basically, what we're looking at is David fulfilling his promise that not only did he make to Jonathan, but also he made to Saul, and that is basically when you become king, don't eradicate our family. Really, is what it comes down to. And so we're going to be looking at what we learn in the second Samuel chapter 9 as we look at David's kindness to Mephibosheth and how he's going to find out about him. Let's begin by reading the text, and then we'll come back and look at the body of the lesson together. It says, "Now David said, 'Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?' And there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'At your service.' Then the king said, 'Is there still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?' And Ziba said unto him, 'There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet.' So the king said to him, 'Where is he?' And Ziba said to the king, 'Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodebar.' Then King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir and the son of Ammiel from Lodebar. And when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, 'Mephibosheth,' and he answered, 'Here's your servant.' So David said to him, 'Do not fear. I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually.' Then he bowed himself and said, 'What is your servant that you should look upon him as a dead dog as I?' And the king said to call Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, 'I have given to your master's son all that belongs to Saul, and to all of his house. You therefore, and your sons and your servants, shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always.' Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, 'According to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth,' said the king, 'he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons.' Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table. and he was lame in both his feet. When we look at this particular lesson, we'll find that David is now king. He is well established. And so he sets out to do what he has promised to Jonathan and also to Saul that he would do. And that is that he would show kindness to them and not totally eliminate them. When we look at the name Mephibosheth, it means from the mouth of shame. And as we pointed out, it's a possibility that instead of him being named Mephibosheth, that he was named Mephibosheth. And for some reason it was changed over to Bosheth. When we look at the mother of Mephibosheth, may have innocently named him from the mouth of the Lord. The name Baal carries with it the idea of master or Lord. And so in the modern Hebrew, it means husband or master. So it could also carry with it a different connotation here. If that was the way the mother Mephibosheth used Mephibosheth, then she named him, and it was not completely understood. Mephibosheth was a son of Jonathan. David promised Jonathan that that should he be king, that he would not hunt down and kill all of Saul's descendants or ancestors. Because Mephibosheth was lame, as we see in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 3, that he could not really work the land as he normally, as a person normally would. And so he's going to put him in charge, or Ziba in charge, who was the servant of Saul. He's going to put him in charge along with his sons and servants to till the land, bring in the harvest, and provide additional income for Mephibosheth. We'll find that he says that Mephibosheth will eat at my table continually as one of the king's sons. We'll find that Absalom, during the revolt, that Mephibosheth stayed in the city of Jerusalem, and it was reported to David by Ziba when he came out to bring goods to David, who had left the city of Jerusalem, that he says that he asked him where Mephibosheth was, and he says he's still in Jerusalem, and he makes a quote here, and of which later on we'll find that Mephibosheth says that I was slandered, that he says, I'm remaining in Jerusalem. The time may be right for the kingdom of my father to be granted to me. And so when we look at that, we'll find that Mephibosheth said this is a slanderous thing, and eventually he gives up all of his land, and he says, give it all to Ziba, because David has returned to the city of Jerusalem to rule over the Israel, and as a result of that, just go ahead, as David had divided between Ziba and Mephibosheth, he says, just go ahead and give it all to him because you have come back and you are safe and sound. When we look at the friendship of David and Jonathan, it is well documented in the Scriptures. In 1 Samuel 18:1, the soul of Jonathan was knitted to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Chapter 20 and verse 17. We'll find it on the evening when David was forced to leave and no longer sit at the table of Saul. We'll find that Jonathan had said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." And at this point, we'll find that David departs and goes his way to be hunted down by Saul, and Jonathan goes back to the city in verse 42. We'll find that Jonathan realizes, and this is the last meeting that we have between David and Jonathan, as Jonathan goes to the stronghold where David and his men are hiding out and trying to stay away from Saul. He says, "Do not fear." This is Jonathan. "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you." And he says, even my father Saul knows that. And so the two made a covenant. And also David makes a covenant with Saul, which is very similar. And that is, after my death, I want you to not completely annihilate my family. And he promises to do this. The terms of this covenant were set forth by Jonathan before David left the house of Saul. He says, "And you shall not only show me kindness of the Lord while I still live, but that you may that I may not die, but that you shall not cut off your kindness from my father's house forever." And David agrees to do that. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is when David brings Mephibosheth in, and he talks and he's kind to him, we see a kindness here that is parallel to the kindness that God has for us. And that is that he's promised us great things. And so we'll find in our lesson today that David puts forth an effort to keep his promise to Jonathan, and also to Saul, in 1 Samuel 24, 20 through 22. And we'll find that David asked, "Is there still any who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And this is in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1, and this is in the reading that we read a few moments ago. David makes provision for his care. When Mephibosheth comes before him, he prostrates himself on the ground before him. And David says, "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan, your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather, and you shall eat at my table continually." Verse 7. And he could have just basically said to him that, I'm not going to chase you down. I'm not going to try to kill you. But instead of that, he goes a step farther, or two steps farther, really. He says, you will, all the the inheritance of Saul goes to you, and you shall eat at my table continually. So when we look at this, we'll find that he made a promise to Jonathan, and he intended to keep that promise. Do we have any questions or any comments as we look at the introduction here? Anyone? Okay, as we look at the first section here in verses 1 through 5, David is remembering Jonathan and what they have, the kindness that he received from Jonathan, and also the promise that he's made. So David spreads the word as broadly as possible to find any of the relatives of Jonathan. And we'll find that he wants to know if any of those still live. And of course, when we're going to be looking a little bit later when the Gibeonites will come to David, and they will say, Saul tried to eradicate us even after the covenant that was made with us by Joshua. And we'll find that he's going to provide, as he says, what can I do to alleviate the stress that y'all have been under because Saul was after you. And so they demanded 7 of Saul's descendants, in which they took and hanged in reprisal against what Saul had done to try to eradicate them. And we'll find that 5 of the sons come from Merab, who was the older daughter of Saul, and 2 came from Rizpah, who was one of the concubines of Saul. And so 7 of those will be turned over to the Gibeonites to basically take care of the reprisal against them. We'll find that someone tells David that Ziba, who was the trusted servant of Saul, that if anybody would know, he would. And so he brings Ziba in, and he says, is there still anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness? And notice what he says, the kindness of God. And this is what I was pointing to just a few moments ago. David is going to show to Mephibosheth what is very parallel to what God shows to us, and that is that He gives us great and precious promises. He gives us things in spite of what has happened, as long as we are faithful to Him. So as at the same time that David sought to do kindness to Mephibosheth, the king of the Ammonites died, Nahash, in 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1. And so David and Nahash were somewhat friendly, and if you remember, the Ammonites are the descendants of Lot, and so they are related to the Israelites. And so he sends to Hadam, who is his son, and to show kindness. And of course, his advisors take what David is offering to Hadam. They're going to take it as serious, and here's David trying to spy out and see what's going on with us. And so as a result, he cuts off half of the beard of the messengers that were sent by David, and he cuts off their garments at the buttocks, as the scriptures tell us, and then he sends them away. And this brings shame, and David tells them to remain in a certain place until your beard grows back, and then we'll bring you home. And so not long after this, we'll find that war breaks out between David and the Ammonites. And finally the Ammonites are going to be subdued, and they are brought under the rule of David. And so we'll find that David was a dangerous strategist for the Ammonites. And we can go back and look at his record while he was leading Israel out to battle, and God was blessing him. And so Ziba tells him that Mephibosheth, who is a lame son of Jonathan, is still alive. And he asks where he is, and he says he's in the house of Claire, the son of Ammiel, in the town of Lodebar. And so David's going to send for him. So he's going to begin to complete the promise that he has made to Jonathan. And this promise goes a little deeper in that it was made between Jonathan and David and the Lord. And so it becomes more binding because the Lord is involved in this. Do we have any questions or any comments here? Okay, as we look at this particular section, we'll find that Ziba is put in charge of all that Mephibosheth has, and he had been formerly the servant of Saul, and now he's the servant of Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth is summoned to come before David. Do we have any questions here? Okay, let's look at the meeting here between Mephibosheth and David, and see what is taking place here. We'll find that Mephibosheth appears before the king. He fell on his face and prostrated himself, and he identified himself as David's servant, 2 Samuel 9:6. He says, "Do not fear. I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually." Verse 7. And so he goes beyond the idea of preserving life, but he says, "I'm going to provide for you in the process." And so he tells him to not be afraid. And so he calms Mephibosheth down. He promises to both provide him and honor him. He gives him the land of his that was formerly owned by Saul, and he honors him by reserving a place at the king's table for him. So sitting together at the table carries strong connotations of friendship and fellowship between the participants at the meal. Shared meals were a common means of a covenant ratification, as you see in Genesis 26, 26 through 30, Exodus 24, 9 through 11, and of the expression of a covenant solidarity. And so we see, upon hearing David's generous offer, that Mephibosheth responds. He bows himself, and he says, "What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I, in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 8. And so we see David as he is taking care of carrying out the promise that he has made, or the covenant that he's made with Jonathan, and also the covenant that was made with Saul. And you can imagine when Mephibosheth was called, that fear was probably, he was fearful of his life. And so he falls down and he says, "Here's your servant." And when David calls him by name, he again acknowledges him, the fact that he's a servant. And then David begins to say, "Do not fear. I'm carrying out the promise that I made to your father Jonathan, that I would take care and be kind to his descendants." Mephibosheth did not act with a sense of entitlement. Some would have basically said, I was the grandfather, or I was the son of a grandfather who was king. But no, he didn't make any pretense about that. So David not only spares his life, he heaps goodness on him, he protects his life, he restores his inheritance. And this is only a shadow and he saves him from the shadow of death, and he prepares a table or place at the table for him. So Mephibosheth is cared for by the king and will never face destitution. And so the word that is used here, and it's used, David's hesed, and this is the Hebrew, hesed here. It carries with it the idea of a faithful reflection of Yahweh, or of what the Lord has done for us. And so there's no such thing as bare hesed, as we see in Psalm 23 and verse 1, in John 1:16, in the 6th chapter, verse 35, and in the Romans chapter 8, verse 32. And of course, it's mentioned here. And so he's showing the kindness of God, and this is what how David mentions this when he talks about what he's going to do for him. It's is there any descendant of Jonathan that I may show him the kindness of God? And when we look at each of these things that he does for him, it's really a reflection of what God does for us. Do we have any questions or any comments from anyone? Okay, as we look at the last section here, we'll find that Mephibosheth is brought to the city of Jerusalem. He's taken care of, and as a consequence, Ziba is made the servant of Mephibosheth. He's going to till the land. He's going to take in the harvest. And he's going to provide additional funds for Mephibosheth. And the fact is, this is going to be on top of what David is going to do, and he says he'll eat at my table continually. And we'll find that Ziba and his sons would serve him. He had 15 sons and 20 servants. And each of these would provide the work and bring in the harvest for their their master, who is Mephibosheth now. We'll find that Ziba would later show his loyalty to Mephibosheth during the uproar surrounding Absalom's revolt. He brought an abundance of supplies of food for David's men, and said of Mephibosheth, "Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will be restored to the kingdom of my father, the kingdom of my father to me.'" And basically, when David meets him as he comes into the city of Jerusalem, we'll find that Mephibosheth says that I have been slandered. So Ziba is he's kind of stretching it out a little bit, and also Mephibosheth may have been stretching it out a little bit, and so we'll find that as a result, we'll find that that David, that Ziba is he took advantage to regain David's favor in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Also the 19th chapter, verses 24 through 30. And nevertheless, we'll find that the account ends with emphasizing the wonderful results of David's gracious commitment to Jonathan, and that is that King David was moving from one glory to another, and the Bible talks about that God increased everything for David, because David, as we saw in last week's lesson, he puts his priority to serving God. And this may have been the contention between he and Michal, when she was saying, you really showed yourself off as king of Israel today, and she wasn't too happy with the way that he had done, and he says, if it comes down to it, I'll do even more. So he was one who was thoroughly committed to God, and we'll find that Yahweh is making Israel the nation that they had hoped to be all along, and the nation that Yahweh would use to in turn bless the world. And this is why, when you look back in the Old Testament in the history, this is why God kept dealing with the remnant of Israel, because he had made a promise that to Abraham, and he says that through your descendants, a seed would come which would bless all nations. And we see this happening. And so David is the ideal king. He's not perfect. He does many things that are not in keeping with the way that God wanted him to do. In fact, the lesson that we deal with next week between David and Bathsheba and Uriah, it's going to say that the Lord was displeased with what David did, and we'll look at that as we look at that lesson next week. This is the character of Israel wants and needs in a king. Do we have any questions or any comments from anyone? Okay, as we look at the conclusion, Ziba and Mephibosheth probably knew how to take care of themselves. And each of them took advantage and probably stretched a little bit of the truth in order to gain the grace of David. Mephibosheth understood that David could have dealt with his grandfather's house as most Mideast kings did. when one king would take over. And you can see this basically when you look at North Israel. Most of the kings of North Israel were usurpers, in which the reigning king was murdered by the incoming king along with his family. And so we'll find that the great love story of the Bible between two people that stands out is Ruth and Naomi, and also David and Jonathan. And they are. It does not mean that they were homosexuals, as some of the people are trying to say they were. But this is not the case. So we'll find that David's actions in this passage reminds us of the importance of keeping our word, the importance of the promise that they made, the covenant they made, and as Paul charged the Ephesians, therefore putting away lying, let of each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another, Ephesians 4 and verse 25. Do we have any questions or any comments about the lesson today? Anyone? Okay, next week we'll be looking at probably one of the saddest, darkest days in the life of David, and that is the adultery that he commits with Bathsheba, and the fact that he takes the life of her husband Uriah by means of the battle. He tells Joab to put him in the heat of the battle, and when the battle is raging, back away from him so that he may be killed and that he'll die. So we'll be looking at that next week. Any final questions or comments? Okay, we'll look at that next week.